Hey, welcome back. Okay, now in this video we're going to set up the final two materials to complete this scene. The next material we're going to make is for this other piece of wood. Now because it uses a similar material yet it has a different UV map, we can't use the same material that we used for this wooden fence pole. So we're going to create a brand new one. Let's open up the material manager, and what we're going to do is create a similar material to the wooden fence pole material that we have here from earlier. And what we can do is we can actually reuse this same material very easily. Because the two shader networks are virtually identical, what we can do is just duplicate this shader network and reuse it again and simply replug different texture maps into it so that it works correctly. So right click on top of the wooden fence pole material and click on duplicate material. Now we're going to have ourselves a copy of that same shader network. But let's go ahead and rename it. So double click the material node, and we're going to change the name of this to wooden fence, and just for the sake of clarity I'm going to call it, instead of pole, I'm going to call it board. So it's going to be called wooden fence board, just to keep the two separate for organizational purposes so we don't get lost or anything. Okay, perfect. Alright, now we have all the nodes already set up, so all we have to do is plug in the correct images that are supposed to go where they're supposed to go. But first let's apply this material to these objects. So I'll select this board here, that board there. Then I'm going to come over here to wooden fence board, which is this one. Right click and assign material to selection. Assign it to selection. Okay, so now the material is assigned, but it's the wrong material because it's using the wrong texture maps, obviously. So let's change that. Let's go over here to the wooden fence board material, and let's go to image. We're going to go to new from file, and instead of using the wooden fence color, we're going to use the wooden fence board color, which is this one here. So let's open that one up. Okay. Now let's go over to the wooden fence pole cavity map. Go to new from file, and what we want to do is get the wooden fence board cavity map, which is this one right here. Okay, now for the bump map, we're going to go ahead and open up the bump map generator node, go to new from file, and we're going to go and grab ourselves the wooden fence board bump, which is right here. Okay, the value is already set at -2, which is perfect. I'm going to hit F6 to go ahead and clean this up. Okay, everything should already be set up. The cavity map, the texture map, as well as the bump map for this specific material should already be set up and ready to go. So let's do a render region here. Now you can see this wooden board here. It has the correct texture on it. Awesome. Okay, great. So we very quickly set that material up. Now the last material to set up is the ground texture, because as you can see right now we have this we have a white material on the ground, which is the default Phong node. If we look, this is the material that the ground is currently using, the scene material default Phong specularity and just gray, which is obviously no good. So we have to create a brand new ground material. So let's go to materials and let's create a new material. First things first, let's double click the material node and rename this to stay organized, and let's call this simply ground or ground mat. Phong node, we don't want to really use a Phong node here. Let's go ahead and switch to a Lambert node. So let's pull up a Lambert. Let's replace the connections of that with a Lambert. We don't need the Phong anymore. Hit F6 and it'll clean that up for us. Okay, Lambert's what we want to use here, because we don't want the floor to be reflective or have specularity. It's just going to be sort of dirt and little stones and rocks and things like that. Okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to plug in a color texture to this Lambert diffuse, to the Lambert's diffuse port. So let's go to nodes, let's go to texture image. Let's plug that into the diffuse port. Let's double click on image here. We're going to go to new from file, and we're going to go ahead and look for our ground texture, which is going to be right here. Ground color is what we're looking for. So let's open that up. Now it's a 4K image, which means that it's over 4,000 pixels by over 4,000 pixels, just so it looks nice and detailed. So let's go ahead and close that. Hit F6 to clean that up. And there we go. Here's our ground material. Pretty simple stuff. Okay, let's apply this ground material to the ground. Simply left click and drag the ground material from the material manager and drop it onto the ground itself. So now the ground's going to have this texture. If we do a render region, we're going to see that the ground does in fact have this texture, sort of this sandy, rocky type of terrain. Okay, doesn't look too great so far, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to fix that by plugging in more nodes to this. What I want to do is I want to plug in a cavity map to this. So I'm going to go to nodes. I'm going to go to mixers. I'm going to grab myself a mixer node. Okay, and I want to plug the Lambert. The Lambert shader is going to go into the base color of this mixer node. And what I want to do is I want to create a texture image node here, which I'm going to plug into the color 1 slot. I'm going to open up the image node and I'm going to go to new from file, and what I want to do is grab the ground cavity map. There it is. Close that. Hit F6 to clean that up. Oh, and I made the same mistake again. Oops, stupid me. Okay, let me grab that image again. Let me go ahead and go to new from source this time because it's already loaded up. Here it is, ground cavity map. And what I'm going to do is go here and grab my mixer again. Plug that into the base color. Plug this one, the image node, into the color 1. Let's switch the color to pure white and change the mix mode to multiply. And now let's plug this into the surface shadow and photon port of the ground material. Now hit F6 to clean that up. Now let's do render region. And now the ground looks a little bit dirtier, a little more detailed, and a lot nicer than it did before. Looks a lot more detailed. Okay, now we're still not done. We need that ambient occlusion. So let's go to nodes, illumination. Let's go to ambient occlusion. We're going to need another mixer node. One thing that we can do is we can click on this mixer node here, and we can actually copy it by hitting Control C. Then just click here and hit Control V to paste. It's going to paste all this other stuff too that was connected to it, but that's not a problem. Let's just unplug these. Let's plug this mixer node into the base color here, plug the ambient occlusion into the color 1, and we're going to take this mixer node and plug it into the surface, shadow, and the photon ports there of our material. Now let's hit F6. It gets rid of all the stuff that we don't need, and there we go. Now if I render this here, you're not going to see much of a difference. The reason for that is the ambient occlusion effect isn't going to be too visible unless there's objects near the surface of this. So areas where the ambient occlusion effect will become very apparent are areas, say, where the rock meets the ground or the wooden fence poles meet the ground. So you can see it looks nice and dark right there, the way that it should. That looks great, by the way. Okay, awesome. Alright, we're still not done setting up this shader network for the ground. What we're going to do is add a couple more things. We're going to go to nodes, grab a bump map generator, and we're going to plug in this bump map generator into the bump slot here, the material node, just like we've been doing before. Now, I'm going to open up the bump map generator, grab a new image from file, and the one that I want to grab is the ground bump image. So let's grab that one. It's a pretty big image, 4K. And for our bump settings, we want to go with -5. I want the bump to be pretty strong on this, which is why I'm choosing 5. Hit F6 to clean this up. Let me look at. Let's do a little render here to see how this is looking here with the bump map applied to it. Okay, so now the surface looks nice and bumpy, but we can actually make this look even better. Okay, now what we want to do is we're going to use a technique called displacement. We're going to use displacement here, and we actually have the wrong material, ground material. That's the one that we want. We're going to use displacement to displace the surface of the ground and make it look a little bit more realistic by making it look bumpier and things like that. Now, displacement and bump mapping are two different things. Bump mapping doesn't actually change the surface of the object. All it does is it creates an optical illusion, bending the surface normals to make it look bumpy using this grayscale image. What we're going to do is use displacement. Displacement at render time actually subdivides the surface here and changes the surface of the object. Almost, it makes actual physical model changes to the surface of, in this case, the ground. So how do we go ahead and use displacement here? Well, it's actually pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and let's create a, let's go here to nodes, and we're going to go ahead and get an image node here, and we're going to take this image and we're going to plug this image into a change range node. So let's go over here and go to nodes, and what we're going to do is pull up a change range node, which is going to be located right here. In the math section, you'll see change range, and here's our change range node, which is going to be green. That means it's a scalar value node. Don't worry about that right now. It's not really important. What's important is to know how to go ahead and use this node. So let's go ahead and plug this node into the material here, and we're going to plug it into the displacement slot. It's going to help to displace this this material here. Okay. Now, next thing we want to do is we want to plug in this image node here into the input of the change range node, and that's going to automatically create a new node called color to scalar. It's going to convert the color information from the image node into scalar data for the change range node to understand. And scalar is just going to be a numerical value that's going to be assigned inside of this change range node. We'll see more about that when we start to edit the options there. I'm going to hit F6 to clean that up. Now, the image that I want plugging into this image 2 node is not this default image. I want to plug in this image here, this black and white height scale image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little blue icon and plug it into the text node here, which is short for texture. I'm going to hit F6 to clean this up. Okay, so now that grayscale image is being shared. It's being used for the displacement. It's also being used for the bump mapping over here, which is great. That's exactly what I want. Now, as far as settings go for the change range node, if we open it up, we get these parameters here. Now, I want the old range start to be set to 0 and the new range end to be set to 1. Now, for the new range start, I want that to be set to 0, and I want the new range end to be set to 0.5 or half. Now let's go ahead and let's close this right here. Okay, if we open up the color to scalar, you don't get many options. All this node does is convert the color information coming from this gray image and converts into a way that the change range node can interpret it. And that in turn is going to go into the material node's displacement, and it's going to displace this actual object, the physical object, the ground object. Now the ground object is going to need some things done to it. So let's select the actual ground object here. Now let's go over here to selection, and we want to go ahead and open up the geometry approximation node, which is located here. So click on this little gradient icon here to bring up its options, and we'll see that we have the options here that we can go ahead and edit and change to make the displacement actually work the way that we need it to work. So we have different types of parameters here, and the parameters that we're mostly concerned with are the parameters located and the displacement tab. Those are parameters we're going to use to drive the displacement of this object. Now, there's different types of displacement settings you can choose. You can choose parametric, length, distance, angle. We're going to use the find method here to go ahead and displace this. For maximum displacement, we're going to use a setting of 2, which means this can be that's the maximum this object can be displaced. The refinement settings right now it's set to 0.965. That's going to be fine for this instance, and the rest of these options I'm going to leave alone. Now the subdivision limit, the maximum I have it set to 3 and the minimum I have it set to 0. Now the higher that you set these settings to, the better the displacement effect is going to look, because it's going to tell Mental Ray, the renderer here, to go ahead and displace this X amount of times, whatever you choose. If you choose a really high number, Mental Ray is going to go ahead and displace that a lot, which means that rendering is going to take longer to do. So you don't want to go too crazy and set this to really high numbers. In this case, we're going to stick to 0 and 3, which is going to work just fine. It's going to give us a decent balance of speed and of quality as well. Okay, so now that our ground has this texture applied, or this material applied, let's go ahead and do a render region here. See what we get. Now the render is going to take a little bit longer to do, so what I'm going to be doing here is just pausing the video and skipping ahead, just so that we don't have to watch this over and over again. But here we can see the render came out. Now if you'll notice, the render now looks more realistic. The rocks and stones are actually sticking out of the ground. It's not an optical illusion. They're physically there. Mental Ray is actually taking this object and displacing it. It's using the image that we gave it, that gray bump image, which you can see here in the Material Manager. This image right here is being used. And if we render that out, we can see it here. Here's the image. It's a black and white image of the ground. And what Mental Ray is doing is it's taking the dark areas and leaving them alone, and the lighter areas like light gray or even white are being rendered out as parts that stick up out of the ground. In this case, little stones and rocks and things like that, dirt particles, stuff like that. And that helps to make this look a lot more realistic. Okay, so that's going to do it for the shading network for the ground. So there's our displacement mapping. So now if we look at this shader network, it's a little bit complex. We have some color going into a Lambert shader that's mixing and being composited with a cavity map for more detail. In turn, that's being composited with ambient occlusion to make it look even more realistic in terms of shadows and things like that, the lighting. And then we have a bump map, adding some nice bump mapping to this, as well as displacement mapping using this change range node and this color to scalar node coming from this black and white image of the bump map. And that's going into the ground material, which in turn is being, the displacement effect is being determined also by our geometry approximation node here and the settings that we have here in the displacement tab of this geometry approximation. So it all works together to achieve that effect. Now, a question that a lot of people ask sometimes when they're new to XSI and render tree or whatnot is what's happening here. If you'll notice, the ground, pretty much everything is using a black and white image. I'll use the ground as an example. If we look at the ground, in our viewport, it's using a black and white image. You may not want that. You may want to see the color image instead. Now if we go here to the ground material, here's our color image. Right now, there's a different image being used for the ground. And people probably don't want that. Sometimes you may not want that. You may want this color image to show up. So how do we change that? Well, let's open up this material node here. If we go to OpenGL Display, you'll see that the texture selection mode is set by default to track render tree. Well, if you don't want that to happen, what we can do is switch it to use specific image pair or image UV pair, and we can choose the image clip that we want to use. In this case, we can say we want to use the ground color image, and now you'll notice that the image that's used in the viewport is now the ground color instead of the cavity map or the bump map or whatever other map was there. You can do the same thing to all of these other objects and their materials. So if you want to see the wood color instead of the wood bump map, you can go ahead and set that up. Same thing goes for the tin can or anything else in your scene. So that's how you can control that a little bit better. Okay, so that pretty much does it for this. If you want, you can do a render preview here. And if you, I just paused the video there while this thing rendered out. It took a little while, a couple of minutes to render. You can see here in the final render, it's a lot different than what we started off with. Once we add the right materials and we connect the right nodes together in the render tree, we can achieve different effects and make things look like rocks, make things look like ground and wood and old tin cans and whatever you want, basically. So we can see here the nice protrusion effect being caused by the displacement of the rocks thanks to displacement mapping. And also the textures look nice, the lighting looks nice thanks to the ambient occlusion, and all the different effects that are being piped together and composited to achieve this effect. So there you go. That does it for this project anyway, working with the desert. In the next project, we'll get to work on a totally new scene and get to see how we can do some different things using different nodes and different techniques, and work on a brand new scene and get our hands even dirtier with rendering using a render tree here. Okay, so I'll see you in the next project.